Hello, everybody. Welcome to this Wheeler Institute event. I'm Sergei Guriev, professor of economics and dean at London Business School. This event is part of Wheeler Institute's Wheeler Institute for Business and Development series, Rethinking Capitalism, where we bring outstanding speakers to talk about their recent work, recent research, which push the frontier of knowledge in disciplines that we teach at London Business School. And today we have a remarkable occasion where we managed to bring Andrei Shleifer, professor of economics at Harvard, and he is a John L. Loeb distinguished professor of economics at Harvard University, where he's taught almost all of his career. He went to Harvard for his undergrad and did undergrad math. He did his PhD at MIT, and then after a short spell in Chicago, came to Harvard, where he remains for most of his career. Economists in the role have read Andrei's work. I know that he's won many prizes, including the coveted Clark Medal, the American Economic Association's award to the best economist under 40, and they used to be under 40. Well, that was in 1999, actually. Yeah, and I highly encourage you to read Olivier Blanchard's article about Andrei's research that Olivier wrote already in 1999, when he highlights Andrei's contributions to several fields, not only economics, political economy, economics of transition and institutional change, but also to finance. And Andrei has contributed already in 1990s to corporate governance, law and finance, but also to to understanding inefficient financial markets. Already there was a book called Inefficient Markets. And since then, Andrei has written many insightful papers, including on the topic he's going to talk about today, cognitive economics. I can imagine that fully covering the ideas developed in those papers on behavioral finance and behavioral economics, cognitive economics would take many hours. We are going to show you that in about 45 minutes talk, after which we will have a discussion chaired by our own Jean-Pierre Benoît, who is a professor of economics at London Business School, also works on beliefs, biases, behavioral economics, teaches in London Business School and gets awards for excellent teaching. And also, like Andrei, Jean-Pierre is a fellow of Econometric Society, and unlike Andrei, Jean-Pierre is a fellow of British Academy. This is the award you cannot get, Andrei, unless you come to this side of that plot. I'm speaking too much. I'm going to sit down and hand the floor to Andrei. We really appreciate Andrei coming here. It's really a great pleasure and honor you with it. Thank you very much.
So today I'll talk about the very few things I've done since 1999, which I'll broadly describe as cognitive economics. But kind of the organizing theme of this talk is this image. Now, as you look at this image, some of you probably see a duck with the beak on the left and the eye in the center. And some of you probably see a rabbit with the mouth in front and the ears in the back. And this is an image of Duck Rabbit, which goes back to some German satirical magazine in late 19th century. But it illustrates the point that sometimes people, by the way, it's also a feature of all of our cognition that you cannot see both the duck and the rabbit at the same time. You can see one or the other. You can close your eyes if you see a duck, you can close your eyes and see a rabbit after you open them, and vice versa, but not at the same time. Now, this image goes to make the point that we often see exactly the same information or the same problem in completely different ways. And this is an optical illusion, if you like, or a satirical point. But what I'll try to convince you of is that this idea, which is very unusual for economics, for social science, much more common to psychology, that different people, often with the same information, see things in completely different ways, is actually central for understanding beliefs, central to understanding choices, central to understanding learning. That duck-rabbit is actually not an optical illusion, but is pretty fundamental to economics. And what I'll also try to suggest is that, in fact, we're beginning to understand how to incorporate this thought, this idea that we think about things, that we have representations of the world or models of the world that shape our thinking and shape our understanding and choices. That's a very fundamental idea. So just in terms of motivation, here are some questions you might want to contemplate. Is President Trump a criminal or a champion of ordinary Americans? Some people believe he's the former. Some people believe he's the latter. Very few people think he's both. To make it sort of a little bit more controversial, is abortion a human right or a murder? Well, there are people with a very strong view that it's a human right. There are people who have a very strong view that it's a killing. They focus on different aspects of the problem. Very few people think that it has features of both. Is buying a stock a risk or an opportunity? Again, some people see buying stocks as an opportunity to make some money. Other people see it's risky. Only professionals, or some professionals, understand that these two features of the problem need to be combined. There was one of the most famous commercials ever, I think, in the U.S. was this commercial. Well, I'll show you later, of a rental car company called Avis, which said it's a commercial that lasted for 50 or 60 years on billboards and television and so on. It said, "We're number 2, we try harder." So is Avis a loser or an underdog? And some people, it's actually gained a lot of customers with that commercial, which is why it was so successful. But you can see that it depends on how you look at it. So what I'm going to try to say is that there is a lot of dependence in how people assess situations based on their experiences, based on their memories, based on the cues they face that get them to think about something one way or another, and that this dependence actually often shapes their beliefs, their decisions. So a lot of the work we've done on this is theoretical. Today I'm not going to talk about that. I have somewhat limited time, but most of what I'll talk about today is actually some experimental evidence, some statistical evidence, and so on. Let me give you kind of an experimental illustration of, I just gave you an intuitive question. This is one of the most famous experiments in psychology. It's an experiment from Kahneman and Tversky about a rare Asian disease. And this is how it goes. Imagine that the US is preparing for an outbreak of an unusual Asian disease. I don't think you could have an experiment like that, today, given its extreme political incorrectness, but of an unusual Asian disease, which is expected to kill 600 people. 2 alternative programs to combat the disease have been proposed. Assume that the exact scientific estimate of the consequences of the program are as follows. If program A is adopted, 200 people will be saved. Notice it doesn't say how many people will die. That's important. 200 people will be saved. If program B is adopted, there is a 1/3 probability that 600 people will be saved and 2/3 probability that no people will be saved. And so what you find in this situation is that the majority of respondents choose program A, where 200 people will be saved for sure. So they're risk averse, if you want to. Here's another formulation. Same description. If program C is adopted, 400 people will die. If program D is adopted, there is a 1/3 probability that nobody will die and 2/3 probability that 600 people will die. Okay? Notice that program A and program C are exactly the same. Program B and program D are exactly the same. So what happens, the majority of people, not substantial number of people switches their decisions, and the majority prefers program D. Notice this is not a question of risk-loving versus risk-averse behavior, because the payoffs are exactly the same. It's that in the first situation, the focus is on dying, and in the second situation, the focus is on, the first situation, the focus is on saving lives, and the second, it's dying. So the point here is that, again, how we think about a problem shapes how we evaluate it. It doesn't have to do with actual objective payoffs. It doesn't have to do with risk aversion. And I'm going to keep showing you things in which that matters for people's choices. So what is cognitive economics, or what I think of cognitive economics is? What people have done in both standard and behavioral economics is to assume certain amount of stability of preferences, and stability of biases in cognitive economics. What I think the data or the evidence tells us, and this goes back to Samuelson and revealed preferences, and this is like in the Bible of economics. Okay, unfortunately, it's not true, which is to say that people's choices are deeply unstable, deeply sensitive to description, and we need to understand, for many, many problems, the instability and heterogeneity. And what I would argue is, in order to do that, we need to understand cognition, which is to say we need to understand how psychological mechanisms such as memory and attention and perception shape beliefs and shape choices. And so the idea here is to, if you like, to try to start with the things we know from the psychology of attention and the psychology of memory, and try to see how we introduce those ideas into economics. So I'm going to divide this talk into several parts. The first part, which is a little older and I think more widely accepted now, though it's still a bit controversial, is to talk about beliefs as opposed to rational expectations. I'll then talk about memory and attention, and I'll say a few words about how we put it all together. But the idea, the overarching theme, if there is one sentence to take away, is that the psychological forces shape how we think about the problem, and that the interesting irrationality or the interesting lack of, perfect calculation or perfect problem solving comes not from how we solve the problem once we represent it, but rather comes from representation. How, from that first step, that very automatic, mechanical, psychological step. Okay, so I'm going to start with something a little more mundane, which is the problem that started the field of behavioral finance, which is the excess volatility of financial markets. So if you start from the first expression, it's the present value formula, which says that the price of a security, the correct price of the security, is equal to its value, which is the expected present value of its future cash flows. And for much of finance, that expectation, that number in the numerator of that expression is the rational expectations of future cash flows or of future dividends. And at least when Shiller wrote his paper, the discount rate was assumed to be constant. So this is what we teach in the first finance class, which is, price is equal to how to compute the present value of cash flows, and that price in the market is equal to value. Now, Shiller took this calculation a bit further and said, well, let's replace this expected value of future dividends. Let's assume that market participants have perfect foresight and compute the perfect foresight value of future dividends. And he did that calculation for the aggregate stock market, and this is what he found. And this picture earned him a Nobel Prize, I think, completely deservedly, which is that this blue line is what is the fair value of securities of the stock market under the assumption of perfect foresight and with a constant discount rate. As you can see, it's extremely smooth. And the green line is the value of the aggregate stock market, which is extraordinarily volatile. And so Shiller in 1981 posed this challenge to finance, saying, well, if you think markets are efficient, if you think the prices of securities are equal to the present value of future dividends, then the blue line should be just as volatile as the green line. And the reality is very, very different. Well, that started a revolution in finance. The standard fix of the Shiller problem, which I think sent finance into 40 years in the wilderness, is to work on the denominator and to say, can we construct an elaborate enough theory of how R changes with market conditions that we can make this expression, the present value expression, come true. And can we construct utility functions that would justify these discount rates? One can do something else, which is to assume a constant discount rate, just like Shiller did, which is what people used to assume when it all started, but replace rational expectations with survey expectations of future dividends, or future cash flows. Okay, and just to say, look, let's not assume rationality of markets or rationality of expectations. We have data on expectations of future dividends from market participants and other sources. So let's try to do that. That's what happens. Okay, now this, of course, caused a food fight, and as we often have in economics and in finance, but the pictures speak louder than words, which is once you get away from the assumption of rational expectations and you take people's beliefs seriously, there is no more Schiller puzzle, which is another way of saying that stock market's volatile because beliefs are volatile. And if you allow stock market is excessively volatile because beliefs are excessively volatile. So if you take beliefs seriously, you can move forward without getting weird. In fact, let me just briefly go through this. There is a lot of evidence that that's the right way to move forward. It turns out that when beliefs look very optimistic or become more optimistic, there is direct evidence that they're too optimistic, which is to say that the expectations errors are forecastable. There's also evidence that forecastable expectations errors are correlated with returns. Now, this is not a money machine. These are very long-term fluctuations in stock prices, but it seems like there is a substantial predictable component in long-term fluctuations of stock prices. Turns out that, in fact, the same measures of beliefs about earnings growth are very helpful in forecasting investment. They're also very helpful in investment booms and busts. They're also very helpful in forecasting credit spreads. Now, I'm not trying to teach to do macroeconomics in 5 minutes, but what I'm saying is that you get just a vast amount of mileage from, if you don't insist on rationality of expectations, which of course doesn't solve any problems. It just tells you you want to understand where expectations come from, and that's which takes us back to or forward to cognition. Now, again, I'm going to stick with expectations a bit more. So when we looked at some of these data, we proposed a model of expectations, which we call diagnostic expectations, which is the idea that people disproportionately think about or retrieve from memory future outcomes that are distinctive given the data. Okay, and for stocks, it would mean if earnings growth has been very fast, and I think about the future, the queue of fast earnings growth retrieves past experiences of fast earnings growth, and that would cause me to put too much weight on the future being just like that past, which is to say that beliefs in part come from memory. Now, it turns out that that's a model you can apply to the stock market. You can also apply it to stereotypes. You can also apply it to beliefs about political issues and many other domains. So this is my illustration of the model. So let's suppose that this is the truth. So the yellow line is the distribution of the seriousness of Harvard students. Notice I didn't say intelligence, I just said seriousness. The blue line is the seriousness of MIT students, or the distribution of the seriousness of MIT students. And what this model I've just proposed to you says is that the beliefs about the seriousness of MIT students is just, you would put excess weight on the states of the world where the two distributions are most different, which is in the right tail and the left tail. So it will be a rightward shift and the normality. It turns out this is a pretty good model of stereotypes. So let me just, as a pause to slow this down a bit, ask you, I'll give you an example of the question which is not in the notes. What fraction of Florida residents are over 65? I need some answers. I need some volunteers. 100%. 100 what? What was the answer? 40. I need some more.
30%.
30, please. 70, thank you. Well, the correct answer is 17 compared to 15 and a half for the US as a whole. Okay, it's just a tiny bit higher. But why is it the case that we have all these estimates? Because when you think about Florida, you think about Miami and Palm Beach and all these elderly people giving TV interviews about how much they like Trump. Okay? Florida is a huge state. There is a whole gigantic North Florida with with tens of millions of people, I think, who are young and uneducated and have many kids. Okay, so because we focus on something that we retrieve from memory, from our experiences, we get our estimates, our judgments, to be extremely biased. This is another one of the examples. So, suppose I tell you a person is Irish and ask what are the chances they have red hair, or what fraction of Irish people have red hair? And again, people often give crazy high estimates. The correct answer is 10%, but of course the point is the ratio of red-haired Irish to red-haired people of other nationalities is extremely high, and so we overestimate this. Again, this is true. This is also true in the stock market data. So if you actually can measure this, so you have like the probability distribution of future growth rates of firms in standard microdata, firm level data. You have the same distribution for high valuation firms. The high valuations firms have a much fatter right tail than low valuation firms. So that would suggest that in fact the beliefs about high valuation firms are going to be distorted in the stereotype model and biased to the right, and that they would earn lower returns going forward. And of course you find exactly those facts in the data about earnings growth forecasts of high valuation firms. And you also find evidence of low returns going forward. So this stereotypes model, which again doesn't go all the way back to memory, but is a reduced form, actually explains all kinds of data. So when thinking about the Irish, we remember the most distinctive hair color relative to other populations. When thinking about fast-growing firm, we remember the most distinctive Googles, and we overweigh these memorable types, which leads to biases. Here's another example. This is one of my favorite pictures. So this is, every point here is an issue that people are surveyed about. And so you look at a population of liberals and conservatives, or Democrats or Republicans, and you ask them about their views, and then you ask them about a typical view of a Republican and a typical view of the Democrat, okay? And so then, given that you ask them about their views and about their affiliation, you can look at the true difference in views between liberals and conservatives, and you look at the believed difference in views between liberal and conservatives. And what you notice is that on every single issue, the difference in beliefs is higher than the believed difference in beliefs. The perceived difference in beliefs is higher than the true difference in beliefs. And actually, who is doing the believing is irrelevant. So both Democrats and Republicans think that Republicans are much more conservative relative to Democrats than they really are. This is also true about gender stereotypes and all kinds of other issues. Okay, who is doing the believing doesn't matter. What matters is that true differences are exaggerated. This is from a study by Leo Burstein on gender conflict around the world. You actually find people, you ask people, again, on gender issues, their level of support for a particular issue, and their believed level of support among women, and their believed level of support among men. And again, for just about every single issue, the true differences in views between men and women are smaller than the believed differences in views among men and women. So again, so far I haven't done anything kind of like fundamental, but what I've shown you is that once you open up and start thinking about beliefs in a very methodical way, but without assuming rational expectations or rationality, all kinds of things pop up. And what I've shown you is that across domains you have very similar phenomena. Okay, let me switch gears completely and now talk about deeper psychological issues and what they can do for us. So it turns out that research on memory has been around for a very long time. The methods of research on memory, the standard methods, have been around for 150 years. And the way in which it works, now you put electrodes on people's heads, but it's the same thing, which is you give people a bunch of words, you distract them for a little bit, and then you ask them what they remember, which words they remember. And sometimes it's the different kinds of recalls are tested, but it's encoding, distractor, and recall. And so there are three rules, and people have done thousands of experiments. There's more than three, but there's three very basic ones, which is primacy and recency. So in this list of words, we remember the first things and the last things better than we remember other stuff. There is contiguity, which I won't do anything with, which is if I remember a word, I'm much more likely to remember a word next to it. And very importantly, there is semantic similarity, which is to say that if I remember a word or remember an object, I'm going to remember things that are similar to it. Okay, so beautiful experiment on that. I ask you name white things in the kitchen. And somebody will say a refrigerator, a plate, a cup, and keep going. But they won't say cheese or milk. And another person will say cheese, milk, cream, but they won't say refrigerator or plate. Okay, so once our brains start going, there is a big contiguity effect in recall. Now, what that means, and the contiguity thing is important because it tells us that a very important feature of recall is cues. Now, this is why God created advertising, which is to say that when I persuade you or when advertisers try to persuade you, they want you to go in a particular direction. They want to cue you to think about the product or the message that they have in a particular way. And that, of course, is extremely important for economics and social science because we've already talked about that, about how good stock performance or good earnings growth cues thinking about positive scenarios going forward. And that's, again, a much more general proposition. So this is, I don't know what happened here. Let me just describe an example of a memory experiment we ran, which also turns out to be helpful in economics, and maybe will give you an idea of how this sort of very abstract psychological experiments and thinking about beliefs connect. So we show participants on the screen 40 images, for a fraction of a second each. So not like super fast, but reasonably fast, maybe a little bit less than a second each. So there are either words or numbers, and half of them are orange and half of them are blue. And so there are orange words, orange numbers, blue numbers. And so after delay, that's what you do in memory experiments, we tell them a randomly drawn image is orange. What is the probability it's a word? Now, whatever is the answer, it shouldn't depend on anything that they've seen that's blue, because the blue objects are totally irrelevant to the question of whether an orange object is an image or is a word or a number. And so what we do then is we say, look, in the first treatment, all blue images are numbers. So the blue images mess with your recollection of numbers. And in the second treatment, all blue images are words. So the blue images mess with your recollection of words. This is what in memory is called interference, which turns out to be just pretty central to belief formation. So this is what happens in the data. So this is the recall of orange words. When all the blue images are words, messes up with your recall of orange words. And so you underestimate the probability that an orange image is a word. If all blue images are numbers, there is no interference, and you estimate a much higher probability that orange images are words. Okay, that bar is higher than this bar. So this is estimate of, it works for estimates of probability. It works for the recall of orange words. And you can do many manipulations. And so again, what it tells you is an important feature of belief formation, of probability estimates, is similarity to the cue, but also interference from other objects. Okay, so here is a little bit more realistic version of the same phenomenon, a little closer to reality. So we asked a bunch of people to estimate the probability that there is a significant cyber attack in the United States in the next 5 years, creating significant losses to the US economy and infrastructure. Now, it's important that the question is about a cyber attack, because people have no idea what a cyber attack is. And so you need to, whichever direction you send them to is going to significantly shape their estimates. So at the end of the survey, we asked them about their experiences, things like ID theft, financial troubles, loss of a loved one. And more importantly, again, this is a sharp prediction of a memory model. We asked them how similar is, this is after they've given us all the probability estimate, how similar is an ID theft, financial troubles, loss of a loved one to a cyber attack? And so then we could measure how their database of experiences is similar to a cyber attack. For some of them, we also primed them. We asked them to recall, describe experiences before they assess the probability of a cyber attack. So we asked them before, has your ID ever been stolen? Okay, and that's what, again, the data looks like, which is that the assessed probability of a cyber attack is higher if people had experiences that they assess to be similar to a cyber attack. And it's even higher if you prime them with experiences that they subsequently assess to be similar to a cyber attack before they give the assessments. Okay, so we have this model of memory, which is a very classical model. It's not our model. It's a psychology model of memory. And that model actually, A, is testable because it's possible to collect the data, and B, makes predictions for financial markets, for all kinds of domains about how people believe about other groups of people, and for assessments of things like a cyber attack. So memory turns out to be really a crucial building block for understanding beliefs. You can understand using memory models both instability of beliefs and disagreement, can explain economic choices. And what's also important is experiences do not mechanically affect beliefs. They need to be retrieved and used. And a lot of what persuasion, advertising, and so on is managing this retrieval of experiences. Okay, the last thing I want to say a few words about, which is the most fun, is attention. Now, we understand a lot less about attention than we understand about memory. As I said, with memory, we can just take the ideas off the shelf and put the math symbols on them and do economics. There is just extraordinary, I mean, it's not that there is universal agreement, but there's extraordinary agreement. With attention, it's much more complicated, but you can still find some very cool facts that help us understand how attention shapes beliefs and decisions. Let me skip this part. Okay. So this is the coolest thing that I'm going to show you. So you have to pay attention. So the first problem is the most famous experiment in cognitive psychology. It's been run thousands of times. And it's called balls and urns. And it says computer chooses jar A with 25% probability, jar B with 75% probability, jar A contains 80% green marbles, 20% blue marbles, jar B is the opposite. We draw a marble from a randomly chosen jar, it's green. What do you think is the percent chance it came from jar A? Okay, we all learn in school, or at least as undergraduates, that this is a problem in which we need to apply the Bayes rule and to do the inference, and the answer is 57% is the correct answer. Here's another problem. It's called taxi cabs. Two taxi cab companies, the green and the blue, operate in a city. 75% of cabs are blue, 25% are green. A cab was involved in a nighttime accident. A witness later identified the cab as a green cab. The court finds that the witness is able to identify each color correctly about 80% of the time, but confuses it with the other color 20% of the time. What do you think is the percent chance that the errant cab was indeed green? Now, if you stare at the two problems really hard, you will notice that they're identical. And the correct answer for the second problem is 57% as well. Okay, you want to see what happens when you do it? Well, this is what happens. On the left are balls and urns. So this is the mean answer. This is the Bayes answer. There's nobody there, you know. There is in 1988, there was this independent candidate running for president in the US called Ross Perot, who famously said, there ain't nothing in the middle of the road but a yellow line and dead armadillos. And no Bayesians in the world, okay? I mean, none. Neither not even trying, okay? 30% of the people are at the Bayes rate. 20% of the people are at likelihood. The mean, if you just compute the mean answer, is a little below the Bayes rule. And so for 50 years, experimentalists running this experiment and computing the mean said, wow, people are almost Bayesian. There's nobody Bayesian, and nobody. Interesting. What happens with taxi cabs? Same problem. Still nobody anywhere near the base rule. All of a sudden, a bunch of people shift from the base rates to information and overreact. More than half the people overreact. So if you look at the mean and not the distribution, you say, people are overreacting to information. It's the same problem. Okay, this is the basic reality we kind of need to deal with in economics. Okay, this is first order, which is you give people a problem with two features. Some of them focus on one feature, some of them focus on the other feature. Some focus on base rates, some focus on likelihood, just like duck rabbit. Nobody is doing what we tell them to do. You know, maybe professionals, you can say they are, you know, in markets, some professionals matter, but in a lot of situations, it's not the professionals who matter. Now we can ask why, we can conjecture, and in fact, you know, you can find supporting evidence of that, which is, you know, in the first problem, the question is about jars. You have base rates about jars. So, you know, your first intuition might be, well, you asked me about probabilities of jars. You told me the probabilities of jars. That's what I'm going to use. In the second problem, they really wound it up to make it be about information, because there's like witnesses and courts and so on. And so everybody focuses on that piece, pays attention to a different feature of the problem than in the first case. Again, this turns out to be pretty general, which is to say that in inference problems, very few people, just like when you talk about Trump, when we talk about abortion, when we talk about many other things, people don't combine information. They look at one piece of information that strikes them as relevant based on their experiences, based on what you put in front of them, based on the cues. They focus on the part of the problem that they think is relevant to the solution. So you can ask people also which features of the problem they were most interested in. And what you find is that their answers very much correspond to what they think is relevant to solving the problem, to what they say they attended to. Let me skip that. You can do experiments, again, I'm going to skip that, in which you cabify balls and urns, and which you balls and urnify taxi cabs, and it all works well. So this is my last slide. And I want to finish here, which is we're headed in a particular direction, which I'm hoping is correct. Otherwise, all of my introductions until I die will end with the work I did in 1999, which is that, you know, it's not about priors and posteriors and combining the priors and posteriors. It's not about how people integrate in their minds different pieces of information. A lot of what happens when people solve problems, and that applies to, you know, buying groceries or even the most basic decisions, is then people decide based on their experience, based on the problem they're trying to solve, which piece of the data in this huge amount of different data that is in front of them is relevant to solving the problem, helps them solve the problem. because different people have different experiences, because they perhaps totally spontaneously focus on different features of the problem, people will disagree. I mean, experiences are probably much more important than just spontaneity. And so they'll solve the problem differently. So what is interesting, or to me remarkable, if you say, is that Trump, abortion, stock market volatility, stereotypes, balls and urns, taxi cab, rare Asian disease, big swaths of economics and behavioral economics have a unity. And the unity comes from this idea that what matters is this initial representation of the problem, this initial combination of memory and attention that lets you think about what it is. And once people present the problem this way, they can solve it. So let me finish with the world's best dad. Avis is now only number 2 in rent-a-cars, so we try harder. Is this a positive ad or a negative ad? Well, it's a positive ad for enough people that it made Avis a whole lot of money. And that's what matters. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that interesting talk. I'm sure there are a lot of questions. I'll just start with a couple of questions, and then I'll turn to you others. And in fact, I'll start just with the last slide you saw, which is also the first. And you were kind enough to share your slides with me before the talk. And I saw that Avis slide, and then I vaguely remembered the Avis slides. So I went on YouTube and said, let me see those ads again. And then an interesting thing is YouTube also has a little clip of the woman who created the ad and gives her reasoning behind the ad. So, and what she said was, oh, it was an argument I presented, a syllogism. And in fact, the argument is we are better because we're number 2. Okay, that's why. So at the beginning, you presented it as a dichotomy. We're a loser or we're number 2. Is that positive or negative? But in fact, her argument was, no, it's not. Is it positive or negative? The reason we're number 2, the reason we try harder is because we have to try harder because we're number 2. So I'd like to know why you're presenting it as a dichotomy. Even a lot of those, they don't exactly look like a dichotomy to me. And in fact, in economics, as you know, there's a concept of X inefficiency, which would tell us that a monopolist would give you bad customer service, for instance, because they're a monopolist, which is really her argument. You know, Hertz, I guess, was the number 1, and they're giving bad customer service. They're not a monopolist, but they're number 1. The number 2 is forced to try harder. So I don't see that dichotomy. That's
okay. So, well, it's very interesting. Well, there are many things that are very interesting. The first one is, and I don't exactly know 2 ways to look at it, is that the Avis ad, at least in the history of advertising, was created, I'm going to screw up the guy's name, by a guy called, I think, John Bachrach or something like that, who was responsible for many of the most famous ads in the US. And in fact, the book of his famous ads prominently features Avis. So I think there is some revisionism about who is responsible. Not that it matters.
I'm based on YouTube, which is not a good source.
Okay. The more interesting point is that Sam Gershman, who is a psychology professor in the psychology department at Harvard, actually ran this experiment. And after I've been harassing him for, decades, not decades, but years, about Avis and Hertz, and he changed the names, but he had some setting, an experimental setting, in which he said, well, suppose you, again, it's not something, it's not actual choice, it's how people say they will choose. is he showed people that there are you land in an airport, there are two rental companies. One of them says we are the leader in car rentals in the city, and the other says we are behind, but we're working hard, or we try harder. I don't remember whether he exactly copied it. And then he asked people, so it's a published paper in a psychology journal, and then he asked people, which one would you choose and why? And so what happened is that some fraction of the people said they'll choose the leader, and when asked why, they say because the other one is the loser. And some fraction of the people said they're going to pick the second company, and when asked why, they said, they're trying hard, I want to give them a chance. So it's at least in that experiment, and I'm not going to defend that experiment. It was a pretty simple experiment. It sort of looked like that different people focused on different features of the problem. Again, I don't want to say that people never combine different features of the problem, but I think that what you saw in that experiment, as in many other settings, is that they go in different directions based on what they think is important.
Thank you. And you're introducing, I believe you're the one introducing this cognitive economics, and maybe you and your co-authors, and you took pains to distinguish it from traditional economics and behavioral economics. And since we're more familiar with both traditional and behavioral, I just want to ask you about that. In particular, a lot of the examples you gave were right out of behavioral economics. As you know, the very first example with the flu was a framing effect. The very Irish sounded a lot like an availability heuristic and representativeness heuristic. So, and I think I saw the answer to my question on one of your later slides, but I'm going to ask you anyhow. Can you tell us why we shouldn't leave and go, oh, here's a twist on behavioral economics? I saw a lot of behavioral economics examples, and what he's doing is behavioral economics. Can you just clarify why it's not, quote unquote, just behavioral economics?
Well, so I think that you said it, which is that a lot of the motivations of what we do is in the work of Kahneman and Tversky and others. But Kahneman and Tversky, as psychologists, often, that's too strong, often, I would say, showed absolutely no interest in unification. So they had a phenomenon called framing and a phenomenon called, as you said, representativeness and availability, which is very close to memory, and so on. The one time when they showed an interest in unification is with prospect theory and behavior toward risk, but not here, not in the examples that I've talked about. And so what I'm trying to say is we definitely stand on the shoulders of giants, but it's time to unify. And I think we're ready to unify, and we're ready to have one theory, which starts with memory and attention, which is a formal theory, which actually enables us to develop their ideas, but also many other ideas, many other predictions from a couple of ingredients rather than proliferation of heuristics and biases. So I do think that, we love them. We're certainly not trying to run away from them, but it seems to me that we're ready to unify. The direction in which behavioral economics has gone after Kahneman and Tversky is very much in the direction of reformulating preferences, which is to say we have things like beta delta, we have prospect theory, and so on. And without framing, without this extreme sensitivity to problem description, these theories do not give you the kind of instability and heterogeneity that you see in the data. And so one advantage of deepening the discussion or going one level higher to thinking about memory, attention, and representation is that, in fact, you can incorporate this evidence of instability and sensitivity into the analysis.
And is another advantage, which I think I saw touched upon in one of the slides, that in the bias literature, by now there's so many, some even contradict each other, and that you're trying to give a theory or giving a theory which will not have those contradictions.
We hope. We hope.
Thank you. Let me see. Are there any questions?
Thank you, Andrei, for the very interesting talk. It's always inspiring to listen to you. So I have a question about the last part, about attention. So one way to interpret the Ernst and Maxi Caps problem is indeed attention, people paying attention to different things like the duck and the rabbit. And another way to interpret is the cognitive limitation. So Bayes' law, I learned it 25 years ago at school in the university. I forgot all about it, and I just don't know how to answer the question, so I randomly pick one of the numbers. But these are the subjects that you studied, and people are getting more sophisticated. Now there is ChatGPT. Control a problem in ChatGPT, and everybody in this room can do that and give you the right answer. So could that be changing? Could that affect the attention pillar of the theory that you are describing? Thank you.
Well, let me say a couple things. I think that people observing most recent US elections generally have not concluded that the public is getting more sophisticated. That has not been kind of a universal assessment of the situation. I think what's important is two things, which is, and this was related to one of the slides I've shown, which is that it's not that people are, I mean, you're right, it's cognitive limitations. That's absolutely true. But the question is how it is that when people don't have a clue, what do they do? Okay, and I don't think it's the case that what they do is random. What I think the data tells us is what they do is what it looks like to them. Okay, and so, or what it is that they've seen before that this looks like. And, you know, there is now growing evidence from field data, from financial data, that in fact the retrieved experiences are what shapes which way people go. And it's attention is an ingredient in representation, an element of representation, because it controls what kind of a problem people think it is. And these regressions I've shown you about cyber attack is direct evidence of this phenomenon. And there is a lot of other evidence. You know, people had, there's a paper out of Berkeley that says that if people had some bad personal experiences, they think inflation will be higher next year. You know, definitely irrelevant, but in terms of objective updates, but that's how people think about that. So now, in terms of people becoming more sophisticated, remember, I mean, this is actually very important. You need to understand what the problem is. You're absolutely right. This is really fundamental and first order and incredibly important. which is if I understand that I'm facing a problem of combining the priors and the information, then ChatGPT will for sure tell me, oh, Bayes rule is relevant, da, 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 da. But I don't know that. Okay, I don't know that. I don't know that this is a Bayes rule problem. In fact, hardly anybody knows that this is a Bayes rule problem. And so this idea that somehow I will know to ask about the Bayes rule is a bit far-fetched. And this is true about most things. It's what's important about human cognition is that once we think that some aspects of the problem are relevant, we don't think about the others. Okay? We don't think about the others. They're erased. Okay? And once they're erased, you know, if you think about, how could I put it? If you think about people who think that Trump tells it like it is and is a champion of ordinary Americans and so on, his crimes, it's not that they don't know about his crimes, it's not that they haven't heard about his crimes, but they're irrelevant. They're simply irrelevant to the problem at hand. So if I think this is a base rate problem, the information is irrelevant to the problem at hand, okay? And so it's, you know, it's once I know to combine, absolutely I can use ChatGPT. But most of the time, I don't.
I think part of your answer there was in those experiments, so we framed in that way so that we can have a definite answer, you know, and analyze it.
Yes.
The problem we're actually given in life is rarely going to be, here's a math problem set up this way.
That's right.
And therefore, you know, put it in, if I put it in ChatGPT, probably with slightly different phrasing, I'll even get different.
But this is actually what people are discovering. That's a fantastic point, which is that, you know, the exact way in which you ask ChatGPT a question fundamentally changes. But precisely for that reason, because how you frame the question sends the search in completely different directions. Thank you.
I'll take one more from the front and then I'll move to the back.
Or this side. Not clear this was working. It's got a green light on the okay. And I should know maybe it is. Very, very interesting as always. But let me put you a question coming out of something I just saw today or yesterday on the web, and that is some survey responses about inflation in the United States. And you had, before the election, you had Republicans self-identified as expecting 4% inflation. And so, how did it go? Democrat, no, yeah. The Democrats were expecting low inflation, Republican expecting high inflation.
And it flips.
And it flipped. Complete.
Yeah.
Republicans now expecting zero inflation. Democrats expecting 4% inflation. Is that based on the stories that you tell? Would that be based on their recollections of inflation experience under different governments?
No.
Or would it be based on their political?
No, I would say it slightly differently. So again, the thing that I tried to show in this evidence on cyber attacks is, and in fact there is some evidence, what I'm about to say is based on some data, not on a spontaneous response, which is a central feature of how people form beliefs about many things, is when they don't know the answer. People don't know what inflation is to a first approximation. They certainly have very limited idea in forecasting inflation. But they're going to try to search their memory, or not try is too strong, automatically search their memory on things that they might think are holistically relevant. And so if you're a Republican, you think things are good. They weren't good, they're now good. If you're a Democrat, you thought they were good. You think now they're not good. And so that piece of data, which you can say is non-domain specific, is irrelevant, is actually going to be relevant for how people form their inflation expectations. My guess is if you ask Republicans and Democrats about the number of sunny days next year, you're going to get the answers to flip, just like the answers about inflation. Again, what comes through in this data is we are literally searching our minds for what might be relevant to answering a question which we don't know how to answer. And as you said, I'm giving people mathematical problems or whatever it is. But and so what they bring to that problem is what they retrieve as being relevant, which in our analysis or in professional analysis may be utterly irrelevant or relevant in a different direction. But that's how we represent reality.
Yes. Thank you for the talk. So you just said that your ultimate goal was to develop a unifying theory behind all those psychological phenomena. Then do you have a step-by-step roadmap in mind to how to achieve that free will, and all of you things to take us to get there?
So you can look up, you can look at a very recent paper on my website called A Cognitive Theory of Reasoning and Choice, which I think goes quite far. If you ask me, I don't know what you mean by the complete theory, but I would say this is picking up pace. I mean, if you asked me 5 years ago, I would have been extremely grumpy and pissed off at the fact that nobody wants to do this. And it's been a pretty dramatic change in the last 5 years. Now, my guess is that 5 years from now we'll be pretty far along, so you should join us.
You heard it here first.
Thank you very much for presenting the ideas. I want to actually return to the first question that was asked in a slightly tangential way. One thing that you did include in the slide, I don't know if they're available for studies, is the degree of certainty provided those. And thinking about that, the context of accessing more resources or to answer a question becomes then a determination by the individual who has access to those resources. How good do I think my representation of the problem is? And do I need to access those special sources? And so I guess the question that I want to pose is, to what degree do individuals' heterogeneity in their confidence and their ability to make a representation, their ability to make her, and across what I would feel to be access to those additional resources when people aren't sure about their representations are most relevant?
So that's a fantastic question. Let me say a few things. So a lot of research in this field has focused on the idea of computational complexity and the notion that conditional on a representation, people who are less confident about harder problems, and they move less from some benchmark, when they're less confident. What's very important about that, and people like Mike Woodford and my colleague Bernanke and many others have focused on this class of issues. What's very important about that class of issues is that this is within a representation. This is computational complexity given representation. When it comes to people figuring out, people picking a representation, and we don't really quite understand why, they're very confident. They're confident and wrong. And so, there is this famous set of examples related to the bat and ball problem, which is the stupidest thing in the world. You tell people, a bat and a ball cost $1.10. A bat costs $1 more than a ball. How much does a ball cost? And people say 10 cents. Okay, and MIT undergraduates say 10 cents. And you say, are you sure? And they say yes. Okay, and you say, like, what's going on here? And this is pretty, if you think about another example, which I didn't talk about, which is gambler's fallacy, which is you say you have a fair coin, there are 4 heads in a row, what's the probability the next one is a tail? People say 60%. Okay, it's on the screen that it's a fair coin. Okay, there's no computation, there's no nothing. Okay, they think about the problem the wrong way. They think they're estimating whether how unfair the coin is, and so they give some or whatever. So in representation, and I want to say that this is the law of gravity, but there is a very important phenomenon of being confidently wrong. So it's not the case that there is a monotonic relationship between the correctness of the answer, if you like, and the certainty in the answer. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's my cognitively certain attempt at answering it.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much for the talk. Really, really inspiring. Since we are here in the Willis Institute debate is really by the Willis Institute, one of the first that I would like to do is what are the main takeaways that we could take in terms of cognitive ergonomics that we can apply for the government in all the public policies?
Okay, thank you. I didn't pay this gentleman to ask the question. I should emphasize that. Look, to me, the most important takeaway is that, this is why I had a little dump on Samuelson in the middle of my lecture in the early parts, is that if we really want to understand what's going on, let me step back. Since the 30s or the 40s, we've had this idea that the only relevant object for economic analysis is choice. That we have choice data and we analyze choice data and we screw around like crazy to make our theory fit the choice data, but all the other data suck. Okay? That's wrong. And that's deeply wrong. And not only that, we actually can measure other things. We can measure experiences in many situations. We can ask. We don't have no surveys that go over long periods of time. We can measure cues. We can measure how the question is asked, and then we can map the cues to retrieved experiences. We can measure, that's harder, attention. And so we can not just theorize, but we can actually build models and test models of beliefs and of choice that are based on data other than choice data. And then we don't need to throw our hands and say, something is a puzzle, like, we can analyze problems using this kind of information. I can give, again, I'm not going to go to too much of a change. Advertisement works on frequent consumers of a product, okay? Has exactly zero to do with information, okay? The people who increase their purchases of Coke when Coke is advertised are regular Coke buyers, also regular Pepsi buyers, okay? Because it reminds them, Coke ads remind Pepsi buyers to buy Pepsi, okay? So again, once you change the frame, once you change how you think about it, you can ask, well, there's actually a lot of data on people's experiences with buying things, on ads, what ads they watch, and so on. So you can bring reality into thinking about pretty standard problems of economics. So I think the takeaway is about measurement, whether it's in finance, whether it's in consumer choice, whether it's in political choice, etc. We need to understand a lot more about people than their choices.
Let me just jump in and ask something based on your answer there. If I was you to defend Samuelson, who really doesn't need me to defend him.
Yeah, it's doing okay,
I
yes.
might say, well, of course, we have a lot of data now that Samuelson didn't have, so that's one difference. But one thing we always had was survey data, and which psychologists always took very seriously, and economists never took seriously. When I was getting my PhD, which kind of ignored that for a bunch of reasons, which you're familiar that would be given. And I'd like to ask you why you think economists are now taking survey data much more seriously than they did before.
Okay, so let me say these are fantastic questions. Thank you for inviting me. So first of all, it's not true that economists never took the survey data seriously. The National Bureau of Economic Research was created to collect and analyze survey data. Survey data was an essential part of macroeconomics starting in the 1930s and I think all through the 1960s. The survey data, like a bunch of other data, like a lot of data in finance, were destroyed by the rational expectations revolution, which basically said expectations are, as I tried to show at the beginning, are a function of the model, and that people understand the model. And so they're not separate from the information on quantities and prices that we already had. And that was, there are some, if you want historical support for that, there is some astoundingly obnoxious lecture by Ed Prescott in, I think in 1977, in which he lets it all out about his views on surveys and measurement of expectations. So you can precisely date this transition. And I think why we're coming back is, I'm going to go back to, since it's getting late at night, I can say things I like, which is that, it's, I think in a lot of fields, in macro, in my view, certainly in finance, the insistence on rational expectations has kind of got us into ridiculousness or absurdity or whatever you want to call it. And so young people are looking around and saying, this is getting weird. And so there is an opening, which is why I think some of this research is picking up into, and I think there is a lot less ideology than there used to be. There is an opening for these theories and, more importantly, measurement to come back in a much more disciplined way than there is a famous line by Tom Sargent that says, once you leave rational expectations, I can't remember whether you're in the desert or you are in the in wilderness, in the wilderness, and I think right now we can actually operate in the wilderness.
What's our timing? Last question.
The question over there.
Jungle. Once we're in the jungle. So what's wrong with the jungle?
Hi, thank you so much for the lecture. I think it's fantastic. Well, I have two questions. The first one is related to the human traits and relationship with the cognitive economics. And the second one for this, what is the relationship and how strongly the human traits affect the cognitive economics? And the second one is more related, what is the relationship between traits and the beliefs, and that is results of the cognitive economics? Thank you.
Okay, so I'm not going to answer because I don't know, but let me answer a closely related question. So look, I think that what this evidence and what the theory tells us is that a big part, so I don't know what you mean by traits, whether you mean something like intelligence or some other things, but a big part of representation is recognition. Okay, so math problems that look completely bewildering and unconquerable to me, to a mathematician, will look like something they can solve in a second. And some of it is that they're a lot smarter, but most of it is that they've seen something like that before. And so they recognize the problem as something familiar. So I think the step, which I don't understand, but which is an interesting step, is one between traits and recognition, and whether or not there is a relationship between human traits and the ability to recognize the problem as something that they can manage or handle, and so on. So that's a piece of it which I think is within reach of you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.